My 6-year-old son was bleeding out in the ER, and my father said he was too busy to come. I remember standing in that hallway, still shaking, still in the same torn clothes from the accident. The monitors were beeping down the hall. The fluorescent lights felt like they were burning straight through me. I could barely breathe, let alone think straight. But I knew I had to make that call. With trembling hands, I dialed my father's number. After 2 rings, he picked up. His voice was calm, almost annoyed, when he said to me, "Emily, I can't drop everything right now. I've got a deal closing tonight." Right then, something inside me went completely still. Not the kind of still that brings peace. The kind that comes right before something breaks. I stood there in that hospital hallway, my son fighting for his life just a few doors away, and I thought to myself, maybe I never really had a family to begin with. At that moment, I didn't know that 3 days later, they would show up at my son's hospital bed, asking for money. Hi everyone, my name is Emily. I'm 34 years old, and I work as an ER nurse here in Seattle, Washington. I've been doing this job for almost 10 years now. I've seen car crashes, heart attacks, overdoses. I've held strangers' hands while they took their last breath. I've learned to stay calm when everything around me is falling apart. That's what this job does to you. It hardens you in some ways, and breaks you open in others. But nothing, and I mean absolutely nothing, could have prepared me for the night my own son was the one on the gurney. His name is Lucas. He was 6 years old when this happened. Bright kid, obsessed with dinosaurs, always asking me why the sky changes color at sunset. He's the reason I get up every single morning. After my divorce, it was just the 2 of us in a small apartment on the north side of the city. We didn't have a lot, but we had each other, and honestly, for a long time, that felt like enough. Now, my side of the family, that's a different story. My father, Richard, is a real estate investor, 60 years old, sharp suit, sharper tongue. He built his career on closing deals and cutting losses. And somewhere along the way, people became part of that equation too. My younger brother Daniel, he's 32, and he basically became a carbon copy of my father. Same mindset, same priorities. Growing up, I always felt like I was on the outside looking in with them. They had this bond, this shared language of ambition and money, and I never quite fit into that picture. I chose nursing. I chose service. And in their eyes, I think that always made me the lesser one. I had learned to live with that distance. I told myself it didn't matter anymore, but on the night of the accident, I found out just how much it still did. That night started like any other. Lucas and I were on our way home from his soccer practice. The roads were wet. The lights were bright. And then I saw the headlights coming straight at us. The truck didn't slow down. Not even for a second. I saw it coming from the left, headlights cutting through the rain like 2 white knives. My brain registered what was happening before my body could react. In that fraction of a second, every instinct I had as a mother kicked in at once. I yanked the wheel hard to the right and threw my right arm across Lucas's chest. It was pure reflex. The kind of thing you don't think about. You just do it. Then the impact hit. The sound was nothing like what you hear in the movies. It wasn't a clean crash. It was this horrible, crushing groan of metal folding in on itself, glass shattering, and then this pressure, this unbearable weight pushing in from every direction. The world spun. I don't know how many times. And then everything stopped. For a moment there was nothing. No sound, no pain. Just a strange, hollow quiet. The first thing I heard when I came back to myself was Lucas. He was crying. And I want to tell you, in that moment, that sound was the most beautiful thing I had ever heard in my life, because it meant he was still there. I tried to turn toward him, but a sharp pain tore through my left shoulder and I gasped. My side window was completely gone. Rain was coming in. I could taste blood on my lip. With my good arm, I reached over and touched his face. His cheek was wet. I couldn't tell if it was rain or blood or tears. Through the ringing in my ears, I managed to say to him, "I'm right here, baby. I'm right here. Don't move, okay? Don't move. He looked at me with those big brown eyes, absolutely terrified, and said back to me in a broken little voice, Mommy, my tummy hurts. That's when my nurse's brain switched on. Internal. The word landed in my chest like a stone dropped into deep water. A child saying their stomach hurts after blunt force trauma means internal bleeding until proven otherwise. I knew that. I had seen it dozens of times on shift. But knowing it as a nurse and living it as a mother are two completely different things. I unbuckled myself and ignored the pain screaming through my shoulder. I could hear voices outside now. Someone was calling 911. A man was knocking on what was left of my window, asking if we were okay. I pressed my hand gently against Lucas's abdomen and he winced and let out a sharp cry. Right then, a cold wave of dread washed over me. I forced my voice to stay steady when I said to the man outside, My son needs an ambulance right now. Tell them possible internal bleeding, pediatric, 6 years old. The man repeated it into his phone immediately. The next several minutes were a blur. Sirens, flashlights. Hands I didn't recognize lifting Lucas out of the car onto a stretcher. I tried to follow, but my legs weren't cooperating the way I needed them to. A paramedic caught me and eased me down onto the wet asphalt. He said to me in a firm, calm voice, We've got him. Let us work. I watched them load my son into the ambulance. His small hand was limp at his side. His dinosaur hoodie, the green one he insisted on wearing everywhere, was soaked through. And just before the ambulance doors closed, I caught one last look at his face. His eyes were shut. The paramedics were moving fast. Too fast. At that moment, every wall I had ever built around myself crumbled all at once. I wasn't a nurse anymore. I wasn't the woman who stayed calm in a crisis. I was just a mom, sitting on wet pavement in the rain, watching the ambulance pull away, completely powerless. When I opened my eyes again inside the second ambulance headed to the same hospital, I was already on my way back to the ER where I worked. Except this time, I wasn't walking through those doors to save someone else's child. They told me my son might not survive the night. Those words came from Dr. Patel, one of the attending physicians I had worked alongside for 3 years. I knew his face. I trusted his face. But standing on the other side of that conversation, hearing him say it to me as a parent instead of a colleague, it felt like the floor had been pulled out from under me. He stood in the doorway of the room they had put me in, his voice low and careful, and said to me, Emily, the scans show internal bleeding near his spleen. We're prepping him for surgery right now. I want you to know we have our best team on this. I nodded. I kept nodding like that was the only thing my body knew how to do. The pain in my shoulder had been wrapped and treated. A small cut on my forehead had been cleaned and closed. Physically, I was okay. But inside, I was completely coming apart. After Dr. Patel left, the room got very quiet. Just the hum of the hospital around me. That familiar sound that I had never once found comforting until I was desperate for something, anything, to hold on to. I sat on the edge of the exam table and stared at my phone in my hand. My contacts list was right there on the screen. And the first name that came up, the first person I thought of, was my father. I don't know why. Maybe old habits die hard. Maybe somewhere underneath all the years of distance and disappointment, there was still a part of me that believed he would show up when it really mattered. That when everything fell apart, he would be my dad. So I called him. It rang 4 times. Then his voice, polished and unhurried, came through the line. Emily. Kind of late, isn't it? I swallowed hard and said to him, Dad, Lucas and I were in an accident tonight. He's in surgery right now. It's serious. I need you here. A pause. Not a long one. But long enough to tell me everything I needed to know. Then he said to me, in that same calm, boardroom tone, I can't drop everything right now. I've got a deal closing tonight. This is a big one. I'm sure he's going to be fine. My throat closed up. For a second, I genuinely couldn't speak. I tried again, and this time my voice cracked when I said to him, Dad, they said he might not make it through the night. Your grandson is 6 years old and he's on an operating table right now. Another pause. Then I heard voices in the background on his end. Laughter, the clink of glasses. He wasn't at home working. He was out. He lowered his voice slightly and said to me, "Emily, you're a nurse. You know how to handle these situations. Keep me posted." And then he hung up. I sat there holding the phone against my ear for several seconds after the line went dead. The beeping of monitors down the hall, the distant roll of a cart on linoleum, the faint sound of my own breathing. That was it. That was all I got. I told myself maybe I hadn't explained it clearly enough. Maybe he hadn't understood how serious it was. So after about 10 minutes, I called again. This time it rang 6 times and went to voicemail. His voice on the recording was crisp and professional. "You've reached Richard Carter. Leave a message." I pressed my lips together and said into the phone, "Dad, it's me again. Please call me back. I really need you right now." I hung up. I waited. I watched the door. I watched my phone screen. Nothing. Out of desperation, I called my brother Daniel next. He picked up on the second ring, which for a split second gave me a flicker of hope. But before I could even finish explaining what happened, he cut me off and said to me with barely concealed irritation, "Look, I'm kind of in the middle of something with Dad right now. I'm sure he'll call you when he gets a chance." Then he was gone too. I set the phone down on the bed beside me. I looked up at the ceiling of that small hospital room, the same kind of ceiling I had stood under hundreds of times while someone else's family fell apart around them. And right then, sitting alone in that room with my son in surgery and my phone completely silent, a thought settled over me like something cold and permanent. I still hoped maybe I misunderstood. So I called again. But this time, nobody picked up at all. I didn't call them, but they came anyway. Around midnight, I heard a knock on the open door of my room. I looked up expecting a nurse, maybe someone coming to update me on Lucas. Instead, standing in the doorway were Margaret and James, my ex-in-laws. Margaret was still in her pajama top, tucked into a pair of jeans, like she had gotten dressed in under 2 minutes. James had his coat on inside out and hadn't even noticed. The moment Margaret's eyes landed on me, still in my torn clothes, my shoulder wrapped, the dried cut on my forehead, her face crumpled. She crossed the room in 3 steps and pulled me into her arms without saying a single word first. And that was it. That was all it took. Every wall I had been holding up since the crash just collapsed. I buried my face in her shoulder and I cried in a way I hadn't let myself cry since the ambulance. After a long moment, she pulled back, held my face in both hands, looked me straight in the eyes and said to me with a steadiness that I desperately needed right then, "We're here, okay? We're not going anywhere." James stepped forward and put his hand on my back and said to me in that quiet, solid way of his, "We got the call from your neighbor Sarah. She saw the accident on the news and recognized your car. Tell us what you need." I blinked. My neighbor Sarah had seen it on the local news, tracked down Margaret's number somehow, and called them. People I hadn't even thought to call had already mobilized before I could process what was happening. Meanwhile, my own father had hung up on me and gone back to his drinks. I told them what Dr. Patel had said about the surgery. I told them about the internal bleeding, the spleen, the timeline. James listened carefully and nodded and then said to me, "Okay, I'm going to go find the attending and get an update directly. Margaret's staying with you." He was gone before I could even respond. Margaret sat down beside me on the edge of the bed and took my hand and didn't try to fill the silence with empty reassurances. She didn't say "I'm sure he'll be fine" or "don't worry." She just sat there, present, solid. And somehow that meant more than any words could have. About 40 minutes later, James came back with coffee, a sandwich from the vending area down the hall, and a direct update from the surgical nurse on duty, who he had somehow charmed into giving him more information than they typically share with non-immediate family. He sat down across from me and said in a calm, measured tone, "They're about an hour into the surgery. Bleeding is being controlled. The surgeon feels good about where things are heading. Lucas is strong, Emily. I exhaled for what felt like the first time since the crash. A wave of relief so overwhelming it made my hands shake. Sitting there between those two people, I felt something I hadn't felt in a very long time. Safe. Not because the situation was safe. Lucas was still in surgery. I was still sitting in a hospital room in torn clothes. But I wasn't alone. And that difference, that single difference, was everything. I looked at Margaret at one point and said to her quietly, "I called my dad. He said he was busy." She didn't react with shock. She didn't perform outrage for my benefit. She just looked at me with this expression I can only describe as deeply sad, and she squeezed my hand tighter and said to me simply, "I know. And I'm sorry." She didn't say more than that. She didn't need to. But sitting there in that quiet room, with James across from me and Margaret beside me, watching the two of them coordinate silently, refilling my water, fielding questions from the nursing staff, staying wide awake in the middle of the night for a child that was no longer technically their grandchild by any legal definition, something shifted in me. These people had no obligation to be here, no deal to close, no angle to work, they just came. That's when I realized something didn't add up. If Margaret and James could drop everything and drive across the city in the middle of the night the moment they heard, why couldn't my own father make a single phone call back? I found out the truth by accident. It was somewhere around 2 in the morning. Margaret had finally dozed off in the chair beside me, her head tilted back, a hospital blanket pulled up to her chin that James had gone and found for her. James himself was down the hall, keeping watch near the surgical wing in case there was any update. The room was quiet. Lucas was still in surgery, and I was doing what people do at 2 in the morning when they're too exhausted to sleep and too terrified to think straight. I was scrolling. I don't even remember opening the app. But there it was. My father's Instagram. Richard Carter, real estate investor, 60 years old, a man who had told his daughter he was too busy to come to the hospital while his 6-year-old grandson was bleeding internally. His most recent post had been uploaded 4 hours ago. The timestamp put it right around the time I had called him the second time and gotten voicemail. I stared at the screen and felt something cold move through me. The photo showed my father standing in the center of a rooftop venue, a glass of champagne in his hand, grinning at the camera like a man without a single thing weighing on him. He was flanked by a group of men in expensive suits. And standing right there at his shoulder, also smiling, also holding a glass, was my brother Daniel. The caption read, "Big night, big moves." The Carter Group closes another chapter. There were over 200 likes. Comment after comment of congratulations, fire emojis, champagne emojis. Crushing it, as always, Richard. The Carter Group never misses. I read every single one of them. My father was not at home working late on a deal. He was not overwhelmed or unavailable in any genuine sense. He was at a party, a celebration, surrounded by people, laughing, toasting, living his best life. While I sat alone in a hospital room, while Lucas was on an operating table, he had made a choice. Not a conflict, not an obligation, a deliberate, conscious choice. And in that choice, he had told me everything I needed to know about where I ranked in his life. I set the phone down on the bed very carefully, like if I moved too fast, something inside me might shatter. My chest tightened, not with grief exactly, but with something harder, something that felt a lot like clarity, because grief implies surprise, and somewhere deep down, I wasn't surprised at all. That was the worst part. I had spent my entire adult life making excuses for this man, telling myself he showed love differently, telling myself he was just practical, just driven, just not the demonstrative type. Building a whole architecture of justifications to explain away every birthday he missed, every milestone he minimized, every time he made me feel like an afterthought dressed up as a daughter. And here, at 2 in the morning, with my son in surgery and my shoulder throbbing and Margaret asleep in the chair beside me, Instagram had done in 10 seconds what 34 years of hoping hadn't managed to do. It had shown me the truth without any filter on it. I picked the phone back up and looked at the photo one more time. my father's smile, my brother's posture, relaxed, celebratory, completely unburdened. And I thought about the voicemail I had left. My voice cracking when I said I really needed him. I wondered if he had listened to it yet. I wondered if he had listened to it and then walked back into that party and picked up his champagne glass. Right then, sitting in that hospital room, something inside me went very quiet and very decided at the same time. I wasn't going to call him again. I wasn't going to beg. I wasn't going to explain myself or soften my edges or give him another opportunity to let me down gently. But I also wasn't going to just go silent and let it dissolve into another unspoken thing that we never talked about. No, this time was going to be different. That night, I stopped waiting for them to show up for me, and I started thinking about what I was going to do when they eventually showed up for themselves. I didn't want revenge. I want to make that clear. Revenge implies you want the other person to suffer. What I wanted was something different. I wanted the truth out in the open, where nobody could pretend it didn't exist. I wanted to look my father in the eye and know, without any room for doubt, exactly what I was dealing with. Lucas came out of surgery at 4:37 in the morning. Dr. Patel walked into the waiting area where James and I were sitting and said to me with a tired but genuine smile, "He did great. We got the bleeding under control. Barring any complications, he should make a full recovery." I stood up so fast my vision went white for a second. James caught my arm and steadied me. I pressed both hands over my mouth and just breathed. In and out. In and out. My son was alive. He was going to be okay. For the next 24 hours, I stayed completely focused on Lucas, holding his hand, watching him sleep, answering the doctor's questions, letting Margaret bring me food I barely tasted. But underneath all of that, quietly, in the back of my mind, something was taking shape. 2 days after the surgery, Lucas was stable and sleeping comfortably when I slipped out of the hospital room and walked down to a small cafe 2 blocks away. I had asked Aunt Lisa to meet me there. Lisa is my mother's younger sister. She's the one person on my side of the family who has always called things exactly as she sees them. She was already at a corner table when I walked in, her hands wrapped around a mug, her reading glasses pushed up on her forehead. The moment she saw my face, she said to me directly, "Talk to me, all of it." So I did. I told her everything. The phone call, the voicemail, the Instagram post, the champagne, the 200 likes. I told her about Margaret and James showing up in the middle of the night with coffee and inside-out coats. By the time I finished, Lisa was quiet for a long moment. Then she leaned forward and said to me with a measured calm that reminded me of exactly why I had called her. "So what are you going to do?" I wrapped both hands around my own mug and said to her, "I need to know if they actually care about Lucas, or if they only care about what they can get." Lisa studied me for a moment, and then said, "What are you thinking?" I laid it out for her. I had been contacted by an attorney about a potential lawsuit against the trucking company whose driver had run the red light and hit us. It was early stages, nothing settled, nothing guaranteed, but the attorney had used the word substantial when describing what a settlement could potentially look like. I hadn't told anyone in my family about it yet, and I was thinking about letting something slip. Not the full truth, just enough. A carefully placed rumor passed through the right person, suggesting that the settlement was moving forward and that the number being discussed was significant. Then I would wait. Lisa was quiet again for longer this time. She looked at me steadily and said, "You know what this means, if you do it. You'll know exactly what they came back for." I nodded. She asked me, "And you're ready for that answer?" I thought about the hospital hallway, the phone ringing into voicemail, the champagne glasses and the fire emojis and my father's grin in that rooftop photo. I thought about Lucas's small hand limp at his side on that stretcher. And then I said to her quietly but without any hesitation, "I've been ready for a long time. I just didn't know it yet." Lisa held my gaze for another moment. Then she gave one slow nod and said, "Okay, then let's make sure it counts." I drove back to the hospital that afternoon with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. The kind of clarity that only comes when you finally stop lying to yourself about who people are. 3 days later, the trap worked faster than I expected. They showed up smiling. That's the part I keep coming back to. Not guilty, not ashamed, smiling. It was the 4th day after Lucas's surgery. He was sitting up in his hospital bed, a little pale, a little quieter than usual, but awake and alert and asking me when he could go back to school so he could tell his friends about his scar. That question made me laugh for the first time in 4 days. It was a real laugh too, not the kind you perform to make people around you comfortable. Just a genuine, relieved, exhausted laugh that came all the way up from somewhere deep. Margaret was in the corner chair doing a crossword puzzle. James had stepped out to grab lunch. And then the door opened. My father walked in first. He was wearing a pressed button-down shirt and his good watch, the one he only puts on when he wants to project a certain image. Behind him came Daniel, hands in his jacket pockets, shoulders relaxed, moving through the door like he was walking into a casual lunch and not a pediatric recovery room. My father's eyes swept the room quickly, taking in Margaret in the corner, the monitors, Lucas in the bed. Then he landed on me, and "I'm so sorry I couldn't get here sooner. Things have been absolutely crazy on our end." Right then, a cold steadiness settled over me. I had rehearsed this moment in my head. I had imagined feeling angry, or shaking, or struggling to keep my voice level. But standing there looking at him, I felt surprisingly calm, the kind of calm that comes from already knowing the ending. I said to him evenly, "It's good to see you, Dad." He turned toward Lucas and put on his grandfather face, a broad smile, and said to him with exaggerated enthusiasm, "Hey there, buddy. You gave us quite a scare. You know that?" Lucas looked at him with the honest, unfiltered eyes of a 6-year-old who hadn't seen this man in almost a year, and said back to him flatly, "You weren't here." The smile on my father's face flickered, just for a second. Then he recovered and said with a small, uncomfortable laugh, "Well, I'm here now, aren't I?" He ruffled Lucas's hair and straightened up, and that was the end of his interest in his grandson's condition. I watched him clock Margaret sitting in the corner. Something shifted in his expression, subtle but there. He gave her a short nod. She looked up from her crossword, held his gaze for exactly 1 beat, and then looked back down without a word. That small exchange told its own story. Daniel had drifted over to the window and was looking out at the Seattle skyline with his hands still in his pockets. He glanced back at me and said with a casual half-smile, "Glad the little guy pulled through. Sounds like it was pretty intense. Pretty intense." My son's spleen was bleeding internally, and the surgeon wasn't sure he'd make it through the night, and my brother was describing it as pretty intense, like I'd told him about a rough commute. I kept my expression neutral and said, "Yeah, it was a tough few days." There was a short stretch of conversation after that, surface level. How was I feeling? How long would Lucas be in the hospital? What did the doctors say about recovery? My father asked the right questions in the right order, but his eyes kept moving. Around the room, to his phone, to Daniel, to me. He wasn't tracking the answers, he was waiting for an opening. It came about 15 minutes in. My father pulled his chair a little closer to mine and lowered his voice to what he probably thought was a confidential and caring register. He said to me, "Listen, I heard through the grapevine that there might be some kind of legal action against the trucking company. A settlement situation." I looked at him and waited. He continued, leaning in slightly. "Now, obviously, the priority is Lucas getting better. But if there's something substantial coming down the line, it might be worth talking through how to handle it responsibly. These things can get complicated. You don't want to make any hasty decisions without people around you who understand finances and investments." I let the silence sit for a moment. Daniel had turned away from the window now. Both of them were watching me with that particular quality of attention that has nothing to do with care and everything to do with calculation. And right then, sitting in that hospital room with my recovering son 3 feet away, I felt the last fragile thread of doubt snap clean. There was no misunderstanding here. There was no version of this moment where I had gotten it wrong. My father had not come to this hospital room because his grandson almost died. He had come because he heard there might be money involved. He had chosen a rooftop party over a surgical waiting room. And now he was here, pressed shirt and good watch, talking about responsible financial decisions while Lucas sat in that bed with a fresh surgical scar and a question about when he could go back to school. That's when I decided I wouldn't hold back anymore. I looked him in the eyes and I said something I had never said before, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me back up just a little. After my father made his move about the settlement, I stood up from my chair slowly and said to him in a voice that was completely level, "You know what, Dad? I actually want to talk about that. Can we step out into the hallway for a minute?" He nodded, clearly satisfied that the conversation was moving in the direction he wanted. Daniel pushed off from the windowsill and started to follow. I turned to Margaret without a word, and she was already reaching over to take Lucas's hand, giving me a small nod that said, "Go ahead, I've got him." The three of us walked out into the hallway, and I pulled the door to Lucas's room nearly closed behind me. The corridor was quiet at that hour. A nurse passed with a cart about 20 feet away. Overhead, the fluorescent lights hummed the same way they always do. My father clasped his hands in front of him and said to me in his deal-closing voice, "So, tell me what the attorney said." I looked at him, then at Daniel, then back at him. And I said, calmly and clearly, "There is no settlement, Dad." A beat of silence. His expression didn't change immediately, the way it doesn't when someone hears something their brain isn't ready to process. Then he said, "What do you mean?" I heard from a very reliable source that the trucking company's insurance was looking at a significant number. I nodded slowly and said, "You heard that because I let it get out. I needed to know something, and now I know it." Daniel straightened up. I watched something shift behind his eyes, that quick internal calculation that I had seen my whole life and only recently learned to name for what it was. He said to me with an edge creeping into his tone, "What exactly are you saying right now?" I said to him directly, "I'm saying that 4 nights ago, I called Dad from this hospital and told him his grandson might not survive the night. And he told me he was busy and hung up. Then I called again and got voicemail. Then I called you, and you told me you were in the middle of something and got off the phone in under 30 seconds. I let that sit for exactly a moment before I continued. And then I went on Instagram at 2 in the morning and saw a photo of the two of you at a rooftop party with champagne glasses, posted 4 hours after I told you Lucas was in surgery. The color that moved through my father's face in that moment was something I won't forget. Not guilt exactly. More like the particular discomfort of a man who has been caught not in a lie but in the truth about himself. He said to me stiffly, "Emily, that event was a critical business commitment that had been planned for months. You know how these things work." Right then my chest tightened, not with hurt but with a kind of white-hot clarity that burned through everything. I said to him, "He's 6 years old, Dad. He was bleeding internally. The surgeon told me he might not make it through the night. And you posted a celebration photo." Daniel cut in and said to me with a sharp impatience he wasn't even bothering to disguise anymore, "Look, we're here now, aren't we? What more do you want? You pull some kind of stunt with a fake settlement story and then act like we're the bad guys." I turned to face my brother and said to him quietly but without any softness at all, "Yes, you are. That's exactly what you are, and I needed to see it clearly before I said what I'm about to say." My father's jaw tightened. He said to me, with that cold authority he had used my entire childhood to shut conversations down, "I think you're being dramatic and emotional right now. You've been through something traumatic and you're not thinking straight." And there it was, that sentence. The one I had heard in 100 different forms over 34 years. "You're too sensitive. You're overreacting. You're not thinking straight." The sentence designed to make me doubt my own perception just enough to back down. I looked at my father for a long moment. Richard Carter, 60 years old, pressed shirt, good watch. A man who had built a career on knowing exactly what things were worth. And I said to him, with a steadiness that surprised even me, "I've spent my whole life trying to be enough for you to show up. I'm done doing that. You didn't come when your grandson needed you. You came when you thought there was money involved. And that tells me everything I need to know about what I've actually meant to you all this time." His mouth opened. I kept going. "I'm not going to keep a relationship alive that only runs in one direction. I'm not going to explain myself anymore. I'm not going to call and hope that this time will be different." I looked at both of them, my father and my brother, standing in that hospital hallway with their expensive clothes and their calculated concern, and I said clearly and finally, "We're done, both of you. I want you to leave this hospital. And I don't want you to contact me or Lucas again unless I reach out first." Which I won't. Daniel let out a short, disbelieving laugh and said, "Are you serious right now?" I said, "Completely." My father stared at me for a long moment. Something moved across his face that I couldn't fully read. Maybe anger. Maybe something older than that. He straightened up and said to me in a low, controlled voice, "You'll regret this, Emily." I held his gaze and said, "I really don't think I will." He turned and walked down the hallway. Daniel followed without another word. I stood there and watched them go. The elevator doors opened, they stepped inside, the doors closed. And just like that, they were gone. I stood alone in that corridor for a moment. The monitors beeped softly from the rooms around me. Somewhere down the hall, a cart rolled past. The fluorescent lights kept humming. Everything was exactly the same as it had been 10 minutes ago, and yet nothing was the same at all. I pushed open the door to Lucas's room. He was awake, watching a cartoon on the small TV mounted to the wall, Margaret still sitting beside him with her crossword in her lap. Lucas looked up at me with those big brown eyes and said, "Is everything okay, Mom?" I walked over and sat on the edge of his bed and put my arm around him very carefully, mindful of his side. I pressed my lips to the top of his head and said to him, "Yeah, baby, everything's okay." And for the first time in a very long time, I actually meant it. That was the last time I called him Dad. 2 years have passed since that night, and my life looks very different now. Lucas is 8 years old. He's back to talking about dinosaurs, back to asking impossible questions about the universe, and back to wearing that green hoodie everywhere, even though it's 2 sizes too small now, and I keep telling him we need to retire it. He has a small scar on his left side that he shows off to anyone who will look. He calls it his battle mark. He's doing just fine. More than fine, actually. Margaret and James are still in our lives. Every Sunday, if we can manage it, we drive over to their house for dinner. Lucas runs in the front door like he owns the place, which honestly, in every way that matters, he kind of does. They taught me something I didn't expect to learn from a divorce. That family is not always the people who share your blood. Sometimes family is the people who show up at midnight with their coat on inside out because they heard you needed someone. As for my father, he tried to reach out about 8 months after the hospital. I got a text message from him that said he had been doing a lot of thinking and that he hoped we could find a way to move forward. I read it twice. Then I set the phone down and went back to what I was doing. Daniel never reached out at all, and Aunt Lisa, the woman who sat across from me in that cafe, and asked if I was ready for the answer. She calls me every couple of weeks just to check in. Nothing dramatic, just checking in. That simple act still means more to me than she probably knows. I won't tell you it didn't hurt. Cutting off a parent hurts in a way that doesn't fully go away. You grieve something that maybe never existed the way you needed it to. But here's what I know now that I didn't know then. Protecting your peace is not cruelty. Knowing your own worth is not arrogance. And choosing yourself, after a lifetime of choosing someone who never chose you back, is not something you should ever have to apologize for. So I'll leave you with this question. If you were sitting in that hospital hallway, your child in surgery, your phone completely silent, and then 3 days later those same people walked through the door asking about a settlement, what would you have done? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And if this story meant something to you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. I'll see you in the next one.